And now we want to turn to another story, a very important story, and that's the ongoing issues with apartheid and ethnic cleansing in Palestine. And we are very happy to be joined as we continue the show by Ali Abu Nima, who's the director of electronicintifada.net. Ali, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thank you, Eugene, and thank you, Rania.
Well, obviously, we saw over the weekend, yet again, another round of attacks on Gaza, and also, of course, in the wake of that, further targeted assassinations in the West Bank. I mean, in some ways, I'm always a little hesitant to ask this question, but I know it's one that's always in the media, is sort of why these attacks and why now by the Israeli authorities?
Well, that is the question. And the question of why now is depressingly easy to answer. And that is Israel always has to kill Palestinians because it is an illegitimate settler colonial regime that faces constant resistance from the people whose land it is occupying, colonizing, and stealing. And that resistance is very active. It's very deep and wide in terms of the resistance of the Palestinian people. And therefore, as a colonial entity, Israel has to keep killing Palestinians in the hope that, as Israeli leaders call it, mowing the lawn is the term they use, that, just as an American homeowner might have to go and mow their lawn every week or two to keep it down, the Israeli generals and leaders think that, you have to mow the lawn of Palestinian resistance. But you're not cutting grass there. You're actually murdering men, women, and children. But that is the kind of terminology they use, which just shows really the psychopathy of a settler colonial regime. And that's what we saw in Gaza starting last Friday. Israel carried out an extrajudicial execution of a Palestinian resistance leader, one of the senior commanders of the Islamic Jihad resistance group. A very cowardly attack, but very typical of Israel, where they fired multiple missiles at his home in a residential apartment building, killing him along with a number of civilians. And then they proceeded to bombard Gaza for 3 days, killing by today, because people horribly keep dying of their injuries. At last count, it was up to 48 Palestinians, including 17 children at last count. So this sadly is a repeated pattern, and this is the price of Israel's continued existence as an apartheid and colonial regime. The regular shedding of Palestinian blood is a necessary component of maintaining Israel.
No, that's an excellent point to raise. But, these sort of regular massacres, you and I talked about this a few months back when when it seemed as though Israel was laying the groundwork for some sort of escalation in Gaza. So an escalation with Gaza, because of this mowing the lawn strategy that they openly talk about, is to be expected quite regularly. That said, I think something interesting about this time around, of course, was that it was targeted specifically at Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And whereas previous escalations with Gaza have been between the Israelis and Hamas, of course, Palestinian Islamic Jihad has participated. But what do you think that's about? What is it this time around that has Israel really pointing its guns at Islamic Jihad? Is it because of what's taking place in the West Bank? There seem to be, regular ongoing fights between the Israelis and resistance fighters who are Palestinian Islamic Jihad fighters, specifically in Jenin. And if that is the case, it does, I think, show some sort of new situation here where there's this kind of cooperation in a way between what's happening in the West Bank, between Palestinian resistance in the West Bank and Gaza as well. I don't know if I'm reading too much into that, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I wouldn't read too much into the fact that Israel specifically targeted Islamic Jihad, because they target all groups in turn. Remember, almost no sooner than a ceasefire had been reached in Gaza, Israel, and that happened, I think, on Sunday or Monday. On Tuesday, Israel launched an assault in the West Bank against. It was really an extrajudicial execution, again, in a very densely populated residential area. This was in the old city of Nablus in the West Bank. They surrounded a house where two Palestinian resistance fighters were from the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, which is actually a group that is, at least on paper, linked with Fatah. And they fired anti-tank missiles into the house to execute these two fighters, including Ibrahim al-Nabilsi and Islam Sabouh. And so they will attack, different groups in turn. Israel is going on a big campaign now. The Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz saying, Islamic Jihad is an Iranian proxy, in order to justify the massacre which Israel committed. And he claimed that Islamic Jihad receives tens of millions of dollars a year from Iran. And I only hope that is true, because Islamic Jihad is a legitimate resistance group engaged in resistance against a brutal and illegitimate occupation. And Palestinian resistance groups have an absolute right to receive aid and assistance from anyone who'll give it to them. And as far as we know, Iran is the only country that provides military assistance to the Palestinian resistance. And I think the answer to those who object to Palestinians receiving resistance to Iran is to advocate for more countries to provide assistance to the armed resistance against Israel's occupation and apartheid regime. But, what they always do is, they try to claim that, to use the fashionable term, that Palestinians have no agency, that they're just puppets of Iran, when the reality is Palestinians are fighting and dying and resisting on their own account to liberate their country, and they will take, as they have the right to, assistance from those who will give it. I'm sure if other countries were to provide assistance to the Palestinian military resistance, they would take it. So that's the situation. That's why Israel, for decades and decades, it's the same story that we kill. We've just struck a major blow to the Palestinian terrorists, as Israel calls them, by killing this or that personality. And of course, it never does, because there's another generation of people being brought up in the resistance to fight Israel. And the issue is not that there are Palestinians who are willing to resist. The problem is that there is an occupation and a colonization which necessitates resistance. What's the alternative for Palestinians? They've tried surrender. The PLO signed basically a surrender deal with Israel at the Oslo Accords in 1993. It didn't stop Israel from accelerating its theft of Palestinian land for colonial settlements. In the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority openly collaborates with the Israeli occupation. That doesn't protect Palestinians. In fact, even with the latest massacre in Gaza, Israel has killed more Palestinians in the West Bank this year than in the Gaza Strip. So, Palestinians are in a situation where the surrender doesn't appease the Israelis, and fighting back doesn't appease them. So what are they supposed to do? Clearly, of course, resistance is the way that Palestinians on the ground have decided they have to fight back against the existential threat that Israel presents to the Palestinian people.
Well, picking up on a couple of those points too, and thinking about the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade and the leaders they lost, and Mr. Nabulsi's final statement where he said, "Don't give up the gun." I mean, where does this leave the Palestinian Authority leaders? I mean, it was interesting to see, like, I don't know, the deputy head or whoever say about that, oh, we're honoring our martyrs. But it really does feel, and I know this was an issue about, many people were saying why the elections were delayed, that there is a real distance between the leadership in Fatah and the Palestinian Authority and really even their own, quote unquote base and their organization. I mean, where do you think this leaves them in this current moment after having, such a prominent leader assassinated and celebrated in the West Bank?
I mean, they're puppet rulers, and everybody knows it. All Palestinians know it. The so-called international community knows it. The Palestinian Authority doesn't represent anyone. It openly collaborates with the Israelis. The attack in Nablus was in an area that is ostensibly under Palestinian Authority control. How can Israeli troops just enter into the middle of, downtown Nablus without the Palestinian Authority knowing? I don't know what happened in this particular case, but typically when the Israelis are about to attack Palestinians in a Palestinian Authority area, they inform the Palestinian Authority to withdraw its men so the Israelis have free reign. And we know that there are, there's a well-documented pattern of the Palestinian Authority actively collaborating with Israel to arrest, torture, and even kill Palestinian resistance fighters, because the Palestinian Authority is the US-backed proxy in Palestine, and it's part of the apparatus of oppression and occupation and colonization of the Palestinians. So, and then of course, what we saw in terms of the reaction to the Israeli attack was, of course, absolute full support from the Biden administration, from the European Union, from Britain, from Canada, from all the usual suspects. The condemnation of Israel's attack came from, the majority world, let's call it, from Malaysia, from South Africa, from various other countries that strongly condemn this. Interestingly, Russia, which has historically been close to Israel and supportive of Israel, and we know that there is, Russia, despite its intervention in Syria, has allowed Israel to continue to keep bombing Syria, and that has to be mentioned. But it was interesting to see that the Russian embassy in Egypt issued a statement attacking Israel for its criticism of, alleged Russian atrocities in Ukraine, in Bucha, saying, how dare Israel attack Russia and claim Russia did this when Israel is, attacking, showing utter disregard for Palestinian lives in Gaza. So the minority world, the NATO Euro-Atlantic countries, full square behind Israel. The rest of the world, to a much greater extent, sees the reality. But unfortunately, whereas Israel is getting huge supplies of weapons and support from the so-called West, it's only Iran that is militarily supporting the legitimate Palestinian resistance. And that needs to change. We need to see much more support for either there's only two ways to do this. Either the so-called international community has to stop Israel, rein it in, isolate it so that it can no longer harm and kill Palestinians, or they have to help Palestinians fight back. Those are the only two ways to go.
Speaking of resistance supported by Iran, I mean, Hezbollah, the Lebanese resistance group Hezbollah, was, of course, watching this very closely. They're allied with the Palestinian resistance. And, of course, there's this sort of like looming threat of a war with Israel over the maritime negotiations with the offshore gas fields in Lebanon. And their sort of interpretation of this latest escalation was that it showed Israeli weakness. And I'm curious if you agree with that view, in the sense that, Israel is constantly, quote unquote, mowing the lawn, right, to reestablish its deterrence. But it doesn't seem to me that this has reestablished or established any deterrence, in the sense that the Palestinian resistance still has the capacity to strike at Israel. Islamic Jihad, which is a small faction, right? Islamic Jihad isn't the biggest military group that Palestinians have, and they were able to launch hundreds and hundreds of rockets at the Israelis. So I'm just curious what you think about that viewpoint, that this showed a kind of Israeli weakness.
No, I think that's absolutely right, but that's been true every time. And remember, Israel, and you're right, Islamic Jihad, the Palestinian resistance deliberately kept this as limited a confrontation as they were able to. Their strategy was to force Israel into a ceasefire without too much escalation, and they did that. And despite that, there were no serious injuries and no deaths reported in Israel. But nonetheless, Islamic Jihad was able to disrupt Israel's air traffic, to shut down parts of Israel. There were reports from Israeli cities like Ashkelon that the streets were empty, everything was closed, people are in their houses. And Ben Gurion Airport, they had to stop movements, landing and takeoffs and so on for periods of time. So major disruptions of quote unquote normal life in Israel. But there is no military solution to Israel's illegitimacy. This is a settler colony, a minority population, the Israeli Jewish population, squatting on top of an indigenous majority, the Palestinian people, and squatting on top of them with brute force. That people, any people, who, no matter who they are, will resist that. And a settler colony like that cannot, I've said this before, it cannot bomb its way to legitimacy. It cannot assassinate and murder its way to legitimacy. And eventually it will fail. Israel is not a permanent fact of our region. Perhaps the people are, because, the Palestinians are extremely generous, just as the South African people were extremely generous with their oppressors and said, you can live here among us under conditions of equality, but you can't live here as our rulers, as our oppressors. And Palestinians have said time and again, we will live with Israeli Jews as equals, as people living, in the same country, but we will not accept to be subjugated by you. But Israel's insistence, like all colonizers, is we have to be the masters. We have to be in charge. You have to do what we say. And if you don't, we have the right to kill you. And that is just not a proposition that Palestinians will ever accept. And so either it is permanent and escalating bloodshed, or the Israeli apartheid regime has to be brought to an end. And it will be brought to an end. And I think that these settler colonial regimes, like in Algeria, like in South Africa, tend to become more vicious as they approach their end, because the settler psychosis and settler fear of giving up power really becomes the dominating emotion and dominating response. We have to kill or be killed. But the reality is that the colonized peoples tend to be very generous, some would say much too generous, to their oppressors in making the proposition that we will live with you on conditions of equality. Historically, the colonizers refuse equality and leave. So, 1 million whites left South Africa because they weren't willing to tolerate equality with black people. All the whites left Algeria because they could not tolerate the idea of equality with Arabs in Algeria. And this is really the pattern. It's settler colonialism. We're on this path of settler colonialism that other countries have trod, and it must end in liberation or in genocide. And genocide is not the Palestinians will not allow themselves to be genocided by this brutal regime.
Well, Ali, as always, it's an honor to have you on the show with us here. Of course, director of electronicintifada.net, author of The Battle for Justice in Palestine. Once again, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much.